Hi, Misha here, and we've done a good number of kind of modern gun videos. So I really felt for a change of pace, kind of slow things down. It's very hot outside. Let's talk about some old guns, some Milsurp, some Mausers, and some of my favorite Mausers are Argentinian, Argentine, I don't know. So I've got three here. This is the original smokeless powder. They actually used the 1871 before. This is the model 1891 long infantry rifle. So a pretty early pattern of Mauser with the single stack box mag and firing 7.65 by 53, which is often called Argentine, but it actually started off as a Belgian cartridge. It was for the 1889. We'll talk about it in the history. 30-inch barrel. Yeah, these are really neat, very well made guns. And these are all made in Germany for Argentina. To go along with it, we have the Calvary Carbine version. Much shorter, much lighter. This has about a 17.7-inch barrel. No provision for a bayonet, and actually no front sling swivel either, although it has a saddle bracket for a ring in the back. Turn down bolt. This is still a 91 action, and these two were all built in Germany and all fired the 7.65 cartridge. And then we'll look at my most recent acquisition, the one that replaced both of these, the model 1909. And this still fires 7.65, has the long barrel. But this is a long ring, a large ring Mauser, and it's a cock on open versus close. This is basically a model 98 style, like a very 98 style, but some consider it even a little bit superior because it was made a little after, patterned a little after. And these were produced both in Germany and in Argentina domestically. So an interesting story there. So I thought we would kind of talk about the use of these Mausers down in South America. So even if Milsurp's not necessarily your thing, you know what, like I said, it's hot out. You really don't have much else to do, so let's hang out and just talk about these cool old guns that are actually quite well preserved, a testament to Paul Mauser. Argentina, yes, I know it's Argentina, but anyway, Argentina had a pretty close tie with Germany pretty much since the inception of both countries. In fact, they had adopted the Mauser model of 1871, the 11mm black powder, and were quite successful with it. They also adopted the Remington Rolling Block 1879 rifle, as it were. But these were black powder guns. In 1886, the French shook everything up by introducing the 1886 rifle, what we call today the Lebel. Although the rifle itself was not particularly advanced. It was a tube magazine-fed system. It was the round 8mm Lebel, the fact that it was smokeless powder. Yes, it burned cleaner, but more importantly, it gave better range, better accuracy, better velocity, just overall more reliable, better performance. And it really lent itself well to small diameter projectiles. Before this, a lot of your your black powder, they were large. They were 10, 11, 12 millimeters plus. The newer rounds, from the very beginning, they were playing around with anywhere from 6 to 9 millimeter projectiles. And in South America, an arms race was about to start, and it would continue for quite some time. Now, the Mauser brothers, after developing the tube-fed version of the 71, turned their attention to small diameter projectiles. This is still the black powder days, although kind of getting into the compressed black powder, almost semi-smokeless, that whole era. Unfortunately, Wilhelm Mauser died, leaving Paul Mauser to kind of go it alone. So after a bit of time, he came up with a new system that used chargers, stripper clips, and a new vertical magazine to work with them. And this would compete throughout the 1880s with designs from Ferdinand Mannlicher, the en-bloc system. And then, of course, smokeless powder hit, and then we very quickly get the immediate predecessor to this gun. This, of course, is the Argentinian 1891, and this is based on the 1889 Belgian gun. Now, what Paul Mauser came up with was a new round, 7.65 Mauser, and it was a rimless round, and it was meant for a new charging system. Quite revolutionary for its day and time. There were not very many rimless rounds at that time. Lebel was still rimmed. But it took a couple of years for the Mauser to catch on. Again, Belgium would be one of the earliest users. In fact, the whole FN Herstal factory was set up in combination with Loewe, I don't know, Loeve or WE. Yeah, the factory that no one can ever pronounce, at least me, in Germany. But cooperation there. This would lead to the Ottoman model of 1890, and then this would lead directly to the Argentinian model here. Interestingly, Mauser kind of tempted Argentina to go with this, especially the caliber, because they had the guns, they had the material, and it just worked out better. Now, the 1889 had a barrel shroud. The 91 here did not. But in other ways, it was very similar. It had a cock on closed system, what we would call today a small ring. It had a vertical single stack, removable box magazine, removable for cleaning, straight wrist stock, hardwood. Had this very small upper handguard, essentially held on with piano wire. The barrel was around 31 inches. Overall length was about 51 inches. Very high grade guns. The Loewe guns were made before 1896, and so we know that they're antiques. Then the merger would happen, forming DWM, and the contract would continue. So with DWM marked guns, you do have to be a little more careful to make sure they're pre-1899. But it's amazing how nice these are, like the condition. Argentina would order 180,000 long rifles to equip primarily the Army, but also the Navy would get some. And deliveries would be complete by the turn of the century. And they were generally very well received. This was quite a modern gun when it was adopted. But of course, arms technology was progressing very rapidly at this time. Before we get to the 91 infantry rifles replacement, we should talk about the carbine because they're cool. They also ordered 30,000 Calvary Carbines. And they're pretty typical of carbines of that day. They have a full wood stock all the way out to the muzzle with a protected front sight, no bayonet lug. In fact, originally no front sling mount at all. Just a bracket for a saddle ring back here. Still straight stock. Turned down bolt handle, otherwise similar action. Same little upper handguard. Carbine style versus rifle style rear sight. These are out to 1,400 instead of 2,000 meters on the rifle. And overall length is quite a bit shorter, about 37 inches, with the barrel around 17.5 to 17.8, depending on which source you get to. Under 18 inches. You get the deal. And of course, it's a lot lighter. The rifle is roughly 9 pounds, give or take. And the carbine is not much over 7 pounds. So about 2 pounds, maybe not quite 2 pounds difference, but that's pretty noticeable. And these are neat, but pretty much small numbers. Again, very well made. Although Argentina itself would never use these in direct combat. They would see some action though. But like I said, technology was progressing on quite rapidly. And now we come to my recent acquisition, something I've been looking for a couple of years. A model 1909. Now the 1891 was already an improvement on the Belgian 1889. For example, it had a stronger bolt and slightly reworked receiver to make it better. But it was still pretty early pattern Mauser, essentially first generation smokeless Mauser design. So they had some issues. For example, the extractor was not all that reliable. Also, the bolt, if kind of mismanaged, could result in double feeds. And the stripper clip system, the clips could be better. They weren't always the easiest to use or most reliable themselves. And finally, this big old mag hanging off the bottom, it could be detached in the field, and they felt it was a little too easily lost. So that, on top of just being an older design and not as robust as newer ones, meant that its replacement was not far off. The 1909 is essentially a German Model 98. It's very similar to a Gewehr 98. But it does have some changes, quite interestingly, to make it more like the 1891, or at least, more compatible. Yeah, so we'll get into it a bit. In fact, some people have called this perhaps the best pre-World War I Mauser design, both in terms of fit and finish and just features. We'll see if they're true. Overall, by and large, the 1909 is like the 98, but it was designed explicitly and at the request of Argentina. So there were a few changes. That magazine they were worried about losing, they went to the double stack mag, but it has a new hinged floor plate. Kind of a unique system, and the release is very well protected and not likely to be easily hit. They also slightly reshaped the bolt handle compared to the Gewehr 98, and they gave it a slightly heavier and longer striker firing pin, basically. Unlike the Gewehr 98, which had the roller coaster sights, this has more conventional tangent sights, still graduated out to roughly, 2,000 meters. Doop. And in other ways is very much, we have the longer handguard and whatnot. Now, interestingly, the 09 was made to take the same bayonet as the 91. So the front end looks a little interesting compared to a standard Gewehr 98. And in the same vein, this was made to accept the same chargers of the 91 rather than the improved ones used by the 98. Like I said earlier, they weren't the best in the world, but Argentina, they had a lot of them. So, might as well use them, right? They weren't that bad, I suppose. We also have a semi-pistol grip stock, as you see here, which is kind of a small but very important improvement. Flipping these over, I can show you another interesting thing. Here is the bolt release type for the 91. The 09 has the same, well, it's a different pattern, but they basically took the 98 style and modified it to work the same pattern. Again, just commonality makes sense. The new rifle was the same overall length with the same barrel, but it was a little heavier. Part of it was the beefier 98 action, large ring with a 3-lug bolt. Another part was the heavier, thicker stock back here and up here, just a beefier gun overall. So these were about 9 1/4 to 9.3 pounds, give or take. Kind of interesting. Now they would order 200,000 from DWM, and these would be delivered in the pre-World War I period, so between 1909 and 1914. I do not know the ratio of rifles to carbines. There were carbines, though, and there were some small numbers that were even sniper rifles, at least eventually. On top of that, they would build another 85,000 under license in Argentina at the what we know today as the FMAP factory. And there was another change too. Originally, this fired a round-nosed 211, 212 grain projectile. Around the same time, they would go to a Spitzer 154 grain, some say 170, pointed projectile. Now the new 1909 was calibrated with the sights for it from the beginning, but the 1891 was reworked with readjusted sights, and it became the 1891/09 to fire the Spitzer round. Just kind of find that interesting. So what else can we say about these? Because they had a long, if not always terribly colorful history. Back in front of the camera, because I wanted to talk about just how nice these actions really are. The long rifle here. This is buttery smooth. Now it is cock on closed, so you have to press in, and there is a striker that will stick out the back. Very nice trigger. Notice there's no hold back on an empty. And it does have the typical Mauser safety, but it's only 2 position. Obviously the carbine here is the same, but it has a turn down bolt, which does change the feel slightly. I think this one might even be smoother. Perfectly good trigger. Shorter sight. These little carbines are so neat. But those are the same patterns. What about the 1909 here? Like I said, this is the large ring, and it's a cock on open. Still doesn't have a hold open feature though. And the trigger does have a different feel. Maybe not better or worse, but different. And of course it has a 5-round mag like the others, but it's a double column so it doesn't hang down. And the release is inside the trigger guard here, where it cannot be easily accidentally hit. These old guns are just so well made, guys. Let's bring the carbine back down. We haven't had it out in a while. I do apologize for not having a 1909 carbine. I was lucky enough just to get a decent rifle. I'll keep on the lookout though. Either way, they both served together, and even though Argentina really didn't use it in active conflict much, beginning in 1910 and running through right around the beginning of World War I, several were given to Peru by Argentina, who would use them in a few border skirmishes and incidents and whatnot, and they would see some field use there. And from that point, we would also carry over into the 1930s, namely 1935 and the so-called Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay, wherein again Argentina gave 1891s and 1909s to Paraguay. But Bolivia, well, they didn't like this much, understandably. And having a giant crest on top, well, that didn't help things, even though everyone knew where they came from. We also saw a new version of the carbine appear, beginning in the 30s, around 1931. Just over 5,000 of the original 30,000 carbines were retrofitted with a bayonet lug, and then older 1879 rolling block bayonets were reworked to work with them, becoming the engineer's carbine. So these were all original just cavalries that were reworked to have an engineer's bayonet set up. There were some engineer 09s as well. So they're very much in active frontline service with both the Army and the Navy, and they were exported to about half a dozen nations in South America. There were a lot of little skirmishes and conflicts at that time, and things would obviously not die down for quite a while. There would even be some of the 1909s reworked to fire 30-06 in the 1940s. Kind of neat. And you'd see various other kind of retrofits and reworks. All told, you're looking at just under 500,000 Mausers that served Argentina. You had 210 of the original 1891s, and you had 285,000 of the 1909s, with the majority being the long rifle here. I'm not entirely sure when FMAP built its last rifle. Couldn't actually find that. In fact, there's very little info out there on the 1909s. There's actually more out there on the 1891s, as funny as that is. There are a couple of things I do want to talk about here. A couple of, I don't know about myth, that's not the right word, but things that have been observed with these that I feel like I should point out. In fact, a lot of them have to do with the receiver. Looking at these two, the 1909 and the 91 carbine, you'll see they have kind of a nice, very ornate Argentinian crest on the receiver. But that's actually not very common. Most are like this one. At least most you find in the USA. The crest has been scrubbed off. Now actually, an Argentinian 91 rifle was one of my first Mausers I bought when I was quite young, in my early 20s. And back then, it was said that the importers, back in the 50s, requested that the crest be machined off. And that didn't seem too preposterous, because back then people bought these mainly for their actions, to rebarrel and wildcat and all kinds of stuff, especially the 1909 received this treatment. So it wasn't preposterous, but it actually seems like at least the origination for this was that Chaco War. Because of Bolivia's objections, the Argentine government decided that any rifle exported out of the country should have its Argentinian crest removed if it was sold out of service. This isn't terribly uncommon. Of course, Japan did this with the chrysanthemum, well before World War II for that matter. Yeah, it just makes sense for a lot of reasons. So this would continue throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s, when the majority of these, especially the rifles, came into the USA. So you'll find different scrubs and different ways it was done. I've seen some that kind of look like it was taken off and looks like a Velcro patch there. Others where it's just kind of machined totally off. Yeah, it's not desirable, and I wish this rifle had its crest, but hey, at least the Carbine still has an S crest. And this rifle has two. But this rifle has its own issue. Originally, the receivers were in the white. The barrels were blued, other small parts were blued, but the receivers were made in the white. Certainly the ones from DWM. This one is not. This one is blued. But it seems to be a correct Arsenal rework, reblue, not an American one. And that's because, yeah, when these went through the re-arsenaling rebuild program throughout the decades, they would often get a blued treatment to the receiver. You kind of have to wonder why they left it in the white. It would seem an odd choice. You'd think it would give glare for sunlight when you're trying to look down. I don't know. If anyone knows, please do post why. But you can find these that were certainly reblued in America, typically those guns that were sporterized. But you find many more like this one that just were reworked during military service. Speaking of reworks, these guns were made originally with lots of serial numbers, including things like the cleaning rod. But of course, throughout military service, as parts were lost, worn out, broken, they would get replaced. And some would be brand new parts from FMAP or spares sent over from Germany. Others would just be taken from scrapped rifles, decommissioned rifles. Now these would remain in service well after World War II, not really being declared obsolete until 1959. Some had already been replaced by the FN-49, especially in the Navy in Argentina, but it wasn't until the FN-FAL came along that they were able to really replace their hundreds of thousands of Mausers. And since many saw very light use, they came over in really great condition, and I really like them. Again, you could argue that the 1909 is really the best because it has all the benefits of the 98 system, but a potentially improved firing pin. This is very much a large ring design, hinged floor plate. The only thing I might say could potentially let it down slightly is the fact that it uses the older Chargers, older stripper clips, but that really is a minor point, especially by today's standards. I do think the bayonet lug on this looks cool. Just hanging out there. But yeah, I just really kind of wanted to give these guns their due because I've looked for a long time for one of these. The Carbine came from a friend's collection, and I don't rightly remember where I got the 1891 here. I've had a few over the years in my life. And the 7.65 Mauser cartridge is actually a lot of fun. It's relatively light recoiling and relatively straight shooting, kind of like 308. Not quite as punchy as some other cartridges of that day and time, for example 30-06. But obviously guns like this were plenty strong to take 30-06 if they needed to. Even after these were replaced by the FAL, they were used as ceremonial rifles and reserve rifles and training rifles throughout the 60s and 70s. And even into the 21st century, you can find sailors of the Argentine Navy carrying around some old Mausers, again, just for ceremonial duties. Yeah. Well, I greatly appreciate those that stayed this far, and I hope you enjoy Mausers. They really are very nice. All these old bolt actions are. I love the history behind them. It's amazing that a gun made back in the 1890s can be still well preserved and still perfectly shootable. You can still get this ammunition today. The little carbines, because of relatively how few were made, they're a little harder to find, and quite a large number were converted over into the engineer's carbine with the added bayonet lug. But I kind of like the original Calvary, light and simple. But the 91 was not without its issues, and so it's no surprise that the 1909 would replace it within just under 2 decades. And just, again, the quality of craftsmanship that they had for these prior to World War I. And as far as I know, the Argentinian built examples are just as high quality, which is why they served for decades. So, when it comes to South American Mausers, we all kind of have our taste, and I have friends that collect Brazilian, Chilean. Argentine happened to be mine, but I'd love to hear which ones you might like in the comments. Just maybe which configuration. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, you can always check out the link to the Patreon page. With that, this is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.